This is my review of the book Finding Darwin's God by Kenneth R. Miller. Overall, I enjoyed the read, although by the end it was apparent to me that the book's intended audience was not atheists or skeptics as I had first assumed. It was actually Christians. The book was, for the most part, well articulated, though there are a few notable exceptions toward the middle where I think Miller weighed his message down with too many scientific specifics, especially if his target audience was non-scientific. And it did an especially good job of explaining and arguing for evolution in the first few chapters. Once he's done fighting the good fight for the undeniable validity of evolution, he moves on to critiquing the ways that others who understand evolution have drawn non-scientific conclusions from it. Miller believes that trying to apply evolutionary processes to systems outside of the biological, such as the societal, is an unjustified step. I disagree with this conclusion. I think the concepts of natural selection and evolution, being change over time, can be applied successfully to any changing system. It only makes good sense to assume that in any field where things can change, then there will be a survival of the fittest routine. I will, however, concede that as scientists, we should wait for some evidence to back these claims rather than making or believing them without precedence. My primary motivation for reading the book was to understand the point of view of a scientist who accepted evolution and natural history, and who was also a Christian. Part of my own descent from religion had to do with finding an inconsistency between observable nature and biblical teachings, so I was naturally curious how someone had managed to harmonize the two. I at first thought that he must not take a literal reading of the Bible, and in that assumption I was correct. Miller's perception of God is not predicated on biblical literalism. He does not believe in a God who performs miracles counter to nature or creates things at intervals. His explanation for God is in quantum physics. Quantum physics has to do with the tiniest particles in existence, things like quarks and electrons and photons. Any physicist can tell you that at such a level, events are entirely random and unpredictable. We can only predict the average movements of many particles, not the individual action of a single particle. For instance, we know that if light strikes a mirror, then 95% of the photons will bounce off it and back at us, providing us with an image in the mirror. But the other 5% will pass right through the mirror. While we know these percentages based on averages, we cannot say for certain which particles will pass through and which will bounce off. Miller postulates that it is in this mechanism that God is evident. He would have created the universe with all its many natural laws, which eventually would lead to us, and he would have included this element of randomness for two reasons. One, to make the universe's path random enough that free will is not endangered, as it would be if we were in a universe that followed a strict, predictable path from start to finish, a predetermined path and therefore a predetermined destiny. And two, to allow the possibility within the confines of nature for him to perform miracles. I have two problems with this explanation as his reasoning for believing in God, especially the Judeo-Christian God. The first is that, while it is perhaps the most advanced and well-thought-out argument I have ever heard, it is still at base just another argument of the God of the gaps variety. Miller assumes that because quantum interactions appear random, they actually are random. He also states, quite strongly and more than once, that we will never be able to predict these events. Both of these assumptions are beyond presumptuous. He also makes the even bigger logical error in jumping from the observation, appearance of randomness, to the conclusion, revelation of God. His explanation, God, is only one of many possible. Perhaps there are forces that we don't yet understand that cause the apparently random quantum movements that we observe. Perhaps the universe is just that random as a principle unto itself, an unknown law of physics. His viewpoint is also entirely untestable, as all God arguments ultimately are, and is therefore bad science and bad for the pursuit of knowledge. The second problem I have with his explanation is that his quantum arguments for the existence of God do not even begin to address the many inaccuracies and inconsistencies found in the Bible and other religious tomes. Miller makes the claim that science and religion are not mutually exclusive because they are dealing with different areas entirely. Science, a study of the natural world, religion, a study of the spiritual one. Why then do religious texts such as the Bible make claims about history and the natural world, many of which are in doubt or blatantly, provably wrong? He does eventually address this, and his response is basically that when the Bible is speaking of the creation of the universe and other such events, it is a spiritual creation rather than a literal one. His viewpoint is that the Bible is strictly a spiritual guide and says nothing about the physical world. This is utter nonsense, especially in regards to the history of Jews, written in nearly every line of the Old Testament. And I wonder what he would consider the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ then. A metaphorical story of sacrifice for God's beloved creation? Either it happened or it didn't, and if it was an actual event, then science can have something to say about it. I can respect his argument on philosophical grounds, if nothing else. I can respect that he chooses to believe this thing that cannot be posed as a question of science simply by the fact that it is untestable. And I can certainly respect that he accepts nearly all natural explanations of the universe, regardless of his faith claims, and teaches science enthusiastically and accurately. What I cannot respect is that he would draw a conclusion so far removed from observable evidence that it has no explanation, i.e., we cannot explain God. He is, as his religious predecessors before him, forming his beliefs of how the world should be, and then trying to work observed data into the parameters of those beliefs. Not only that, he is ignoring the vast amounts of the Bible that are provably false by claiming that they are spiritual explanations, not material ones. That being said, I assert a bold opinion, that his brand of religious views are the future of religion, if indeed it is to survive at all. I can picture with clarity a world 100 years from now, in which surviving religions accept all scientific claims about the natural world, and which hold its holy books as speaking metaphorically about the spiritual nature of humanity and our relationship to a spiritual God. Perhaps it will even get to the point where Jesus' death and resurrection become not a historically accurate event, but a spiritual story of redemption, as I speculated about earlier. I will say that Miller ended his book on a very elegant note, though one that doesn't really explain anything. He says that when his students ask him what sort of God he believes in, he directs them to read the last chapter of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, in which Darwin says that the Creator might have breathed life into a few or a single original creature that then gave rise to all other life through evolution. Miller says he believes in Darwin's God. That tells me that, yes, Miller accepts evolution and believes in a God who could have created a universe in which natural forces drove events on their own. And that is where the explanation stops. It doesn't tell me why he believes in the personal God of Christianity, or why he rejects the notion of a deist God, as he explains earlier in the book, or anything of further detail. And it was this detail that I was hoping to read about, and have been disappointed once again in not finding. So my final conclusion is, if you want a book that is really good at explaining the history of evolution and all the scientific explanations for it and evidence for it, then you should definitely pick up Finding Darwin's God. If you're questioning your faith or already are non-Christian and you're looking for a sophisticated argument for Christianity, this is not your book.